So hi everybody, I'm Steve Towns with the Center for Digital Education. I'm here with Steve Caimi today, who is a public sector cybersecurity specialist with Cisco. Welcome, Steve. Thank you for joining us.
I am thrilled to be here, Steve. It's a pleasure.
We're here today to talk about secure distance learning. So no big surprise here. Earlier this year, COVID-19 triggered stay-at-home orders that closed campuses across the nation. And education leaders literally on the fly had to figure out how to enable fully online classrooms. To their credit, they did that. But today, I think we want to look at how institutions responded to that initial crisis last spring and maybe see what lessons or insights that might hold for us as we enter the fall. We're already seeing that those physical distancing restrictions are going to continue into the next academic year. I think now's a good time to maybe talk about some of those lessons learned and see how that might inform what we do now.
Yeah, it makes sense.
All right, Steve, if you're ready, let me hit you with a few questions.
Sure.
I think the first one is, how would you characterize the way institutions transition to online learning this spring? Maybe what's your view on what worked well and what didn't work?
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes before we even get started, sometimes it's worth stepping back and looking at the context around all of this,
Mm-hmm.
right? So one of the things that, and the way I think about cybersecurity, it's a game of risk management, right? You have to look at the risks and the things that are probable and so forth. And no one could have predicted that a global pandemic would bring a complete halt to everything, right? Yes, it could have happened 100 years ago and so forth, but when you're actually making risk-based cybersecurity decisions, one of the things you look at is the likelihood, of something, right? So the context around this is, I don't think any cybersecurity leaders could have really planned or perhaps even should have planned for this, because the resources required to do it would have been, just absolutely incredible, right? Beyond, what any kind of risk management plan, would say. But at the same time, Steve, I mean, you probably would agree, like, I think a lot of the words that rise to the top here are things like, disruptive and disorganized, right? It's easy to point fingers there, but it's no surprise, right? Whenever something like, that this big or this, completely unexpected occurs, right? Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so it's just like the changes that we've seen to things like remote work, everyone being pushed to, to work from home. Students and educators have had to adjust their behaviors, right? Learn new technologies, and they've had zero time to kind of adapt to all that. So when I look at things like, to the second part of your question about like what actually worked well, I think you said it already, right? Wasn't it? It continued, right? That was a good point, right? It wasn't a complete shutdown. It wasn't like a lot of the restaurants that were closed completely, right? To a certain extent, educators worked hard to keep the education process going. So that, that alone is a win, right? And then a second thing that, that I think we saw during the course of this was that, students found that they could kind of work at their own pace, like work on their own schedules. That maybe one of the, the downsides to the, to the process that we saw was that a lot of the live classroom time, there wasn't a lot of it, right, initially.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, teachers would check in with students, but there was a lot of like assignment-based or, parent-led, type of learning. But the good part about that was it really allowed students to sort of, figure it out. If they were early risers, they could get started on things earlier. If something was really easy, they could breeze through it, right? If something was harder, they could spend more time on it. And if they were done, they finished their work, they're done, right? They weren't, like stuck in the traditional bounds of like, classroom, physical classroom time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really pushed institutions into that new model of learning and did it amazingly fast.
Yeah. But there's also a lot that didn't go well, right? There's a lot of things that we learned, from the process. And one of the things that was really, really kind of sad to see was like, a lot of the students that are already suffering from a lot of these like structural inequalities, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they suffered even more, right? It's like really heartbreaking to hear about students who like already have, they face food and housing insecurity, and things like the pandemic made this situation even worse, right? Add, layer on top of that lack of things like internet access, no access to devices, right? It just made the whole situation, for them just incredibly, untenable. So that's definitely a lesson we've learned. We can't allow that, kind of thing to happen again.
Yeah.
A second thing that I would say is like a lot of the parents became the teachers, right? Like because the, the students weren't, the students weren't being led, 24 or the entire time by the actual teachers. The parents were forced to kind of oversee and guide and do a lot of the teaching. So, some parents have the luxury of working from home, but that doesn't mean that they can be productive, right, as a full-time employee and as a full-time educator. And a lot of parents don't have that option, right? They actually have to get out there and work. So a lot of kids ended up, being taught by grandparents or other children and things like that. So the whole thing became, highly problematic, right, and very, very stressful.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Steve, let's look at it. You mentioned the security perspective on this a little bit. Let's dive a little bit deeper into that. Like as you said, I mean, if there's one word that sort of captures the situation, it was disruptive, right? I mean, these institutions really did have to kind of switch on a dime
Yeah.
and do the best they could. And like you said, I mean, it's definitely a win that they were able to carry on. But from a security perspective, what new threats and new challenges emerged, from that really dramatic shift toward fully online courses?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that you probably saw that was highly publicized with some of these attacks on these conference platforms, right? It was all over the news. I'll stay away from the term, that was used out there,
Mhm.
right? But a lot of times educators went and turned to a conferencing platform that would be easy to use, which is good, but they weren't necessarily designed with security and privacy built in, which is bad, right? So we
Mhm.
started seeing people that were able to, sneak and break into these, online classrooms and spread all kind of hate speech and other just really terrible type of material, right? Like very unwelcome type of thing. So I
Mhm.
think one of the things that we learned there is that all these online platforms really ought to be built with security and privacy in mind. And fortunately, I think we've seen that like not all of them are created equal,
Yeah.
right? So yeah. So
So
another
really,
thing I was going to point out too is like
oh yeah.
verifying the user identity. I think
Mhm.
that's been one other challenge too, right? A lot of times students have to go and log into something, right? But they've have given a username and a password that was maybe given to parents, right? Especially for some of the younger kids, right?
Mhm.
So as you're logging into these online platforms, how do you know that the student was actually the right one, logging into it, right? We've talked a little about in the past about how identity is becoming the new perimeter. And I think it's become even more important now to make sure that the right students are doing the right things and that we're tracking those identities. And then I think the last thing too that we've seen a lot is just that, cyber attackers look at this kind of thing and say, hey, look, now that we have more people and devices, educators and students on, wherever they are, whatever networks, we can start attacking them, right, through the normal channels like distributing malware and phishing content or, attacking their devices that are potentially insecure, right? So these are some of the top challenges, obviously certainly not all, but that's some of the things that rose to the top.
Yeah. Yeah, and really, I guess, kind of lets educators know what they need to think about on those platforms, kind of moving forward. It sounds
Yeah.
like. Um, Maybe Steve, as institutions look toward the fall, we know leaders are looking at expanding those online learning options and making them, I think, more dynamic, more interactive. Can you talk a little bit about how best practices for online classrooms are changing, maybe based on the experiences we had in that initial response?
Yeah, and I think one of the very first things that I tend to think about is how important it is to build cybersecurity directly in, right? Don't bolt it on later, right? So there's a lot of really easy ways to make sure that cybersecurity is built into the online learning experience. We have technologies that are out there that are super simple, like multi-factor authentication, right?
Mhm.
Something and something that you have. So a lot of students, might have their own either their a school issued device or they have their own phone, for example, and that can use it for things like a push notification to allow authentication, and that way you can be certain that the person who is logging in is indeed the person who is. We also have a lot of like newer content now that's or technologies like cloud-based content filtering, things that don't have to be picked up and installed in a school, for example, right? No
Yeah.
physical appliances. So things that already filter the web for malware, malicious links like phishing attempts and things like that, right? So cloud-based web and email type of security is, really important. Things like, virtual private network technology, it's been around for a long time. But how about we enable like remote educators and administrators, like the people who actually do have to get into the school systems and
Yeah.
handle secure information. Let's do that in a way that, is really simple for them, right? And then finally, like we mentioned before, that secure web conferencing that enables online learning, but also has the right security and privacy controls built in, like really important there.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so that's the key to really doing this safely going forward. Um, Steve, what about I know, I mean, I know we're still trying to sort out what the fall looks like, but I also think we're hearing institutions kind of looking at some combination of in-person and distance learning for the fall.
Yeah.
That hybrid sort of approach. How should campus leaders be looking at the integration of cyber and physical security? Those two things are going to go together, right?
I don't see how they can't, right? At this point, there's the online classroom, the physical classroom, they're one and the same, right? I think that that's the mindset that we need to now take, right? Because, to your point, there might be a mix of online learning. There might be some parents who simply don't want to send their kids to school, for example. There may be, educators themselves who feel reluctant to go in. Maybe they're in the high risk group, like all those reasons, right? So the online classroom now has to be built into this idea that there's going to be some mix of physical and virtual. Maybe to your point, right? For the first couple of weeks, like where I am in the greater Houston area, some of the schools are looking at the first few weeks of being online only, and then perhaps transitioning to some physical, right? It's still sort of TBD. So that's why I think like the classroom today has to be set up with both, right? So some of the things that we here at Cisco kind of do and focus on to make it really easy for so for school districts, for higher education and things like that is first of all things like Cisco WebEx, right? That has the conferencing platform and the security and privacy built in. We also have a collaboration tool called WebEx Teams, right? That also is enabled to share information, documents, and things like that. Do it securely, right? With a secure group of individuals. I mentioned the things like multi-factor authentication. We have a solution called Duo that's really, really simple, makes it really easy to add multi-factor authentication into almost any application, right? Whether it's in the cloud or on-prem. And then other things like advanced malware protection for endpoints actually helps protect those devices from threats as well, right? So sometimes things will get through and reach the device, but we have to make sure that we can spot that kind of malware and stop it from getting any further, right, in the system or perhaps infecting other things. And remember how I mentioned some of like the cloud-based like web and email type of controls, right? So we have solutions like Cisco Umbrella, for example, that might stop the DNS connection to a bad domain initially, right? But then it can also do things like, act like a web, proxy in the cloud to make sure that all that content going through, is being done securely, and also cloud-based email security, right, to block those phishing threats and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So, and then the last thing I was going to point out is like the AnyConnect movability client that we have that's really super simple, and it's designed for administrators and those who are like school employees to be able to get into those sensitive systems. So like those are the types of technology, certainly not all of them, but definitely some of the things that you ought to think about that are really simple to build into your security platform and the strategy, and something that sort of melds that physical and online classroom together.
Yeah, that's interesting. Steve, any other final advice you'd give to education leaders, particularly as they think about managing cybersecurity threats? And yeah, is what seems likely to be this hybrid environment that also may be pretty fluid, right? I mean, you may have to, depending on conditions, you may be more out of the classroom than in, or vice versa. Any other advice around that sort of environment, and maybe how you sort of change your cybersecurity approach based on that changeable situation?
A lot of times when you think about cybersecurity, a lot of times people are driven by fear, right? Oh my gosh, the latest threat, right? And then you hear about another threat and another threat, and you keep hearing about all these different types of things that we need to constantly react to. And sometimes it's worth saying, look, stop for a second, right? Instead of taking a sort of a reactive approach and trying to figure out like which is the top thing to worry about at the moment, take a step back and look at some of these really well thought out cybersecurity best practices. So I'm going to say, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago that the National Institute of Standards and Technology came out with the cybersecurity framework, which was a really simple way to think about cybersecurity, right? And there are others like the CIS control, the MITRE organization put together an attack matrix to help defenders think of the way adversaries think. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is while there's not any one particular framework that I would recommend, use these frameworks to kind of guide and develop a risk-based approach to cybersecurity. This stuff has already been well thought out, right? So benefit, from that, kind of those best practices kind of approach. We here at Cisco, do that stuff as well, right? We take a best practices approach, and we ourselves, take and align our portfolio. So if you ever want to, check out what Cisco does along those, those best practices, we certainly have that information on our cybersecurity framework guidance page.
So the good news is, I mean, the tools are out there.
Mm-hmm.
The frameworks or the sort of strategy advice is out there. You don't need to reinvent the wheel here. You need to rely on some of those resources that are available to you and understand and learn about them.
Right. And know too that things have gotten a lot simpler, right? The cybersecurity vendor community has made this technology so much simpler to take and deploy and manage, right? That small teams can do it, right? It's not like the days of old where you had to take these big boxes and install it in a data center and rack and stack and have a whole team of people, to manage this stuff. Like the focus and push, to the cloud makes all of this stuff so much easier to do.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I really appreciate the conversation. Thanks for the insight and the help around this issue. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, pleasure talking to you too. Thanks for having me on today.